If we are to say anything publicly, we may be afraid of the blowback. We may also be afraid that what we say will linger forever and ever and ever. In print, physically speaking, or video, emails, and so on. For instance, in a course by T.J. Walker on motivational speaking, he said that we need to toughen up if we're going to put out content, because there will be some people who will hate us. I'd like to take a look, too, at those who are just starting out putting out a body of work and questioning just how much further to put oneself out in the public sphere rather than the private sphere, worrying, fretting, fearing, even catastrophizing that they may take it on the head or whatnot from a number of people. He said then, without explaining how or how he has approached it, he said, you need to toughen up. Well, what does that mean? I think, for instance, some people would approach it by getting what they call defensive. In other words, kind of giving hints of, don't pursue this line of questioning or attitude further, or else I'm going to raise a stink. A stink meaning getting angry or condescending, perhaps, as a way of combating. And hence, one way of, shall we say, toughening up being the developing of a repertoire tool of being combative. Now, perhaps another toughening up tool would be to simply say nothing. You could say bite your tongue, or give a stoic approach. Give a marine look, shall we say, a look that says nothing, inscrutability. More than one soldier, for instance, has done that. More than one politician has done this. I suppose others might say, I'll get back to you, and exit the scene. And if they had gotten riled up, hope to come back when their dander is not ruffled, so to speak. But I kind of refer then to the non-combative approach, one approach being to, quote, bite your tongue. But what about yet another approach? And I heard this put out by a man, Ayman Aghi, who does work with people on course creation, online courses, and public speaking, and he pointed out perhaps another approach. You might call it ironically toughening up, but toughening up in the sense of how to handle criticism that can be rather down-putting and emotionally charged. He said to handle things in his mind and way by becoming Teflon. And I think many people may have heard the phrase in association perhaps with Ronald Reagan, when they referred to him, some people anyway, as the Teflon man. What does Teflon mean? Well, it means that perhaps you shoot something at another person and it bounces right back off. You could call it armor plating of a sort of your ego or something, but at any rate, in my mind it means that you are not reactive in the sense of becoming angry or giving back. What you might say, giving back as good as you got. Or like advising a child, say, if punched by somebody, to punch back. I think the Teflon approach would mean learning how not to have to punch back, and yet not have to put on the stoic look either, the bite your tongue approach. Now, of course, some people can do this. Many people can't. They might be quite reactive, for instance, if their ego is slighted, for lack of a better word, or say if they feel physically threatened or legally threatened, or their future is somehow threatened. You might call it saber rattling in this effect. Noting too, I believe, some people, including some politicians, have adopted a seeming Teflon approach in that they smile constantly, at least sometimes until somebody or another has exited the scene. But I believe this can be perceived and generally can be disingenuous. It hides something by the very nature of a smile put on constantly. Nothing can leak out, so to speak, I believe, concerning any anger or fear emotions on the face if the face has what you might call a painted-on smile, as per what is done with a clown, for instance, when a smile is painted permanently, so to speak, on a person's face for a while anyway. I believe probably the best way, thus, of having the Teflon approach to criticism, often sometimes laden with anger or even veiled threats, is to be able to smile sometimes, not chronically, and better than perhaps also never smiling. The Stoic approach, the Marine approach, whatever you want to call it. This, far easier said than done. And yet, to want to be the person who is, quote, toughened up, or to be able to meet the requirements of the phrase, if you can't take the heat, get out of the kitchen, and thus not have to get out of the kitchen, seems to me this Teflon approach, which is not a chronic smile nor never smiling, is what we might want to shoot for, and that in turn far easier to say than done. For instance, Boris Yeltsin from the Soviet Union, Russia, what have you, in the past found his career flailing or failing and exited the scene for a while, worked on himself, his viewpoint on people, and even got smiling lessons. Did you know that? And then re-entered the scene and did much, much better. Also, Dale Carnegie, who was very famous in speaking circles and wrote, amongst other things, How to Win Friends and Influence People, regarded smiling highly and also urged people to smile. And if you think of it too, if someone can smile some of the time, and thus it is generally speaking in my mind quite genuine, doesn't that reflect a certain amount of acceptance of the other person as to who they are, even if, say, they are angry or we feel physically threatened? If we can accept that, don't we find ourselves not communicating what you might call non-acceptance or hatred? And we all love to be understood or accepted. Hence, isn't it hard to continue to hate someone or issue anger statements, etc., if the respondee is not responding in kind, but rather through communicating a genuine smile, they're communicating that I do not hate you back? Isn't that the best way then to not only be performing this Teflonism, but responding to, shall we say, hate messages back or disagreement that's quite vehement? I'm reminded, for instance, too, of the movie To Sir with Love, starring Sidney Poitier. And as time went on, when he was teaching in a class that was quite challenging for many a teacher, the students were amazed that he didn't give back to them, so to speak, some of the more challenging negatives that they had given him. Now, to the extent this isn't a perfect scenario, maybe this wasn't the perfect demonstration of the concept, but still, wasn't Sidney Poitier exemplifying this concept of Teflonism? At least the message was being tried to portray this in the movie. And the students were quite amazed thus that he was kind of a Teflon man. Isn't that the ideal way, in a sense, to toughen up and to handle criticism, sometimes quite toxic, many would claim? and fear. I've struggled with this issue quite a bit myself. Hence the phrase, perhaps we've heard sometimes, the best way to handle something is in how we react. But, thinking down the line more, does that mean just bite your tongue? Does it mean smile constantly? Does it mean smile never? Maybe the best way of not reacting is because you don't have to react. It's not bugging you. Maybe we feel secure enough. Gary Vaynerchuk, for instance, talks constantly in videos about how we fear itself, whatever we fear is holding us back from doing video work or putting out content. And he claims that he has very high levels of self-esteem going back to his childhood in Russia that has given him the ability to put out content courageously, or so he claims. Seems to me then he's stating several things, and in part that our fears so hold us back. Well, I have always wondered exactly what he's talking about to the extent of how to go further than just talk about have no fear, but still, maybe what we're talking about is being a Teflon person who is not threatened to the point where they have to give back what they got, and you're kind of a Teflon person. Maybe ultimately the best way of doing this Teflonism is to understand someone and to be able to handle whatever may happen in life, to be able to accept that. As one man put it, a motivational speaker, it might have been Les Brown, ask yourself constantly, he said, what's the worst that could happen? If you can handle it, aren't you kind of bulletproof then? Or aren't you kind of a Teflon person then? As far as the criticisms of the bullets of life, you could call it. If you can handle the worst that could happen without regarding it as a catastrophe, maybe not something we desire or find comfortable, that is quite a mind shift, I think, and not easy to pull off, especially to the nth degree. Maybe that's one of the components of being a Teflon person. If nothing can faze you, aren't you Teflon? And isn't that then why they said of first century Christians in particular that they were very fearless of almost anyone and anything? You could call them Teflon in a sense because they didn't fear death. So, I've always wondered, what happens to me and how do I handle putting out more and more content that I've done for years, more into the public sphere? What if some people, quite definitely don't like me much and let it be known? Well, how is it you respond? Are you going to give back what you got? Some say give as good as you get. Are you going to be the stoic-minded person and put on a face of, stoicism, no expression? Are you going to smile constantly? Or can you do something quite different again and not have to do much of anything and thus smile at sometimes not, because your feathers really aren't ruffled? Maybe that's the best way to toughen up, is to not have ruffable, I can't say that quite, feathers that you can find ruffled. If you have feathers that can't be ruffled, aren't you in a sense the ultimate in being toughened up? An ironic way of putting it, perhaps. Seems to me that's the best way of being Teflon or bulletproof in any way, shape, or form in life. And of course, all the more less blowback to a person, the more they say something respectfully, and in turn have developed and polished more and more their vocabulary. I was fascinated on the topic of this for years. My father has a PhD in English literature and did much with me when I was a child in writing. But still, you have to think there. Our words have much impact, And there's a whole chapter of this, by the way, that I looked at once in Tony Robbins' book, Awaken the Giant. He has a whole chapter devoted to words and their impact one way or another. I didn't read the whole chapter, but it's fascinating so far. So maybe an additional part of toughening up, or how to handle criticism, is to be able to get much less of it, all the more you put out things respectfully. And I've read articles to that effect too, and it's just common sense. I'll close with one comment by Brian Tracy. I once ran across in a sales lecture he was talking on YouTube, and that is, if you treat people like you want to be treated, I think that being the golden rule, you're probably going to have much more success as a salesman, and maybe in life in general, including how you say things that you call content, or if not content, something you're offering as a service. The less, quote, insulting, the more accepting, the more respectful, the less problems you're going to have in return in general. And then much less need to even have to be the Teflon person, because you're going to find yourself receiving far fewer bullets, so to speak, in terms of hate looks, hate comments, and attitudes laced with hatred, shall we say, or blame messages, guilt messages, whatnot. Thoughts here.